Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Spiritual Metaphysics 101. My name is Yaakov, and I'm your host. I'm also a student and teacher of A Course in Miracles, which is my spiritual path. Today we're going to be focusing on having a spiritual awakening. And if that sounds to some of you like reminiscent of step 12 in the 12 steps, you're absolutely right. The focus of A Course in Miracles is certainly to have a spiritual awakening and to know the peace and serenity of God. And the 12th step of the 12 steps is having had a spiritual awakening, we carry the message to others and practice these principles in all our affairs. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. It's kind of an advanced view of what happens as we begin to awaken spiritually. So we're shifting from our ego experience in life to a spiritualized experience in life and start to awaken. So here's something I want to read from, it's called The Lighthouse, and it's a newsletter put out by the Foundation for A Course in Miracles, and the article was written by Ken Wapnick, who's my teacher out in California. And Ken makes reference to one of the workbook lessons in A Course in Miracles, and this is lesson 268. It says, "Let all things be exactly as they are." And that to me is very much a symbolic statement, if you will, of an enlightenment or a spiritual awakening. When we're able to let all things be exactly as they are. In 12-step work, we have the 3 A's. And the first A is awareness, and then acceptance, and then action. So let me run by that again. The first A is awareness, having had a spiritual awakening. The awareness, what happens is the second A. We have acceptance. And then the third A, of course, is action. I was thinking today about the 3 A's. I think the first 2 A's should be written in capital letters, awareness and acceptance. And then the third A should be a little a, action, because it may or may not be appropriate once you've had the enlightenment, so to speak, and the awakening and the acceptance of everything just the way it is. What should you do? Very possibly nothing. So that third A is a small a in my estimation. But anyway, lesson 268, let all things be exactly as they are. And then Ken Wapnick writes that if the lesson is correctly understood, it points to a shift from arrogance of our bitterness, which would be the ego, to the humble gratitude that marks our spiritual awakening. Let me read that again. If understood correctly, and we're talking about a spiritual awakening now, and accepting things exactly as they are, this points to a shift from arrogance, which would be an ego statement. I don't like it, it should be thus, not this way. I want it thus, or thusly. What would be appropriate? I want it thusly. Anyway, I get sidetracked here. But if understood correctly, it points to a shift from arrogance of the ego and our bitterness to the humble gratitude, a spiritual awakening that marks our awareness and our acceptance, and then possibly our action. And here's a quote from A Course in Miracles under that workbook lesson. We say to our God when we're having spiritual awakenings, "Let me not attempt to interfere with your creation and distort it into sickly forms. Let me be willing to withdraw my wishes from its unity, and thus to let it be as you created it. What can frighten me when I let all things be exactly as they are?" So there you have the, kind of in a nutshell, a spiritual awakening. What can frighten me when I let all things be exactly as they are? Awareness leads to acceptance, and then maybe, maybe not action. So that's a reference from A Course in Miracles, my spiritual path. And I want to move on now to something that I wrote, and I've made mention of this in previous episodes. It's called A Course in Miracles Journey Through the 12 Steps. And this booklet is available for anyone who emails me and requests a copy. It'll be sent to you free of charge, no cost. So under step 12, where we're talking about the spiritual awakening, Again, step 12 says, having had a spiritual awakening, as the result of these steps, we carry this message to others and practice these principles in all our affairs. And here's what I wrote under step 12. We awaken. Now that's that first A, the awareness. We awaken and our ego dreams disappear. That is the shift from the bitterness that we were discussing to the gratitude of the Holy Spirit. We awaken and our ego dreams disappear. God's promises are fulfilled. A most joyous process, miraculously enlisting us as His spiritual loving messengers. So it's a process. It doesn't happen in one epiphany, in one experience where there's a lightning bolt and you are spiritually awakened. That doesn't happen for 99.99% of us. I know there are exceptions, but the exceptions, I think, prove the rule that it's a joyous process, and it miraculously enlists us as spiritually awake and God's messengers of love. Now, empowered with our true purpose to share this message of love, we join with all of God's children, and every interaction here on earth becomes a reflection of heaven's unity. So we say, as in heaven, so as on earth. Every meeting is now a holy encounter. Everyone is a member of our extended holy family. All 12 steps have coalesced into our spiritual awakening. And the spiritual awakening is that shift from ego, where we talk about bitterness, and I want it thus, I don't want it this way. And that has to be a process because it's so contrary to the way we think. All of us are so egocentric that we want it this way. People, places, and things. Not this way, the way it seems to be or appears to be. Now the irony is that it appears to be this way because it reflects our beliefs and our thoughts. So it's not something that's foisted upon us against our will. And we'll get into this a little bit in this segment. It's really consistent with our intent. It's consistent with our beliefs. It is a projection of our thoughts, and we see it and we don't like it, but we projected it. So that gets back to, where does the change have to come from? Certainly not in I want it thus rather than this way, because there you would be changing something that originates from within our minds. It has to come from the seat of cause, and that is the mind. So a nice adage is, seek not to change the world, but seek to change your thoughts about it. You change your mind, you change your experience in the world, and you see it differently. Anyway, again, anyone that wants a copy of the booklet, please contact us, and there'll be an email address that you can write to and request it. Now we're going to get into another book that I've been reading, just finished it. It's Father Richard Rohr's book, Breathing Underwater. And it's a wonderful, the subtitle is Spirituality in the 12 Steps. So here again, we're talking about having had a spiritual awakening, the 12th step. And I apologize to some of you that may not have worked the steps or have worked the spiritual path for very long, because having a spiritual awakening is kind of a, not a culmination, because we're always having insights along the way. But many of you may be stuck in the issues and the circumstances and the problems, and you're eagerly anticipating a spiritual awakening, so you see things differently. But I'm hopeful that this episode will give you some insight as to how to change your thinking. And in an instant, God's love and God's strength, God's wonderful light will shine away the darkness in those circumstances, and they will appear differently, and you'll have a spiritual awakening. Now, you may go back to sleep, as 99.999% of us do, so the process continues, and we seek to have another spiritual awakening by changing our minds consistent with God's will, not our own will. So Richard Rohr writes something beautifully here. He says, I'm afraid that Bill Plotkin, psychologist and agent of cultural transformation is truthful and fair when he says that we live in a patho-adolescent culture. One of the few groups that name that phenomenon unapologetically is Alcoholics Anonymous. Read, for example, page 62 of the Big Book. Quote, "So, our troubles are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves. And the alcoholic, or read the 99.99% of us, we all have an ism of some kind. If it's not alcoholism or drugism, it could be codependencyism, it could be shopaholicism, it could be sexaholism, it could be overeatingism. Anyway, he says, so our troubles are basically our own making. This is out of the Big Book. They arise out of ourselves. And the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he or she does not think so. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us." And then Richard Rohr says, what courage it took him to talk this way. He's referring to Bill W., who wrote the Big Book. So this selfishness makes reference to Bill Plotkin, the psychologist, reference to our culture as patho-adolescent. It must be, I want it thus. I don't like it this way. Back to the unaccepting mind. And the unaccepting mind is in such conflict with ourselves because, as I had said just earlier, we made it up that way. It was a projection of our thinking and our beliefs, and then we stomp our feet patho-adolescently and say, no, I don't like that. Change it. You be different. You move over there. You extend, your apologies to me because I feel slighted and so forth. I want to share a personal experience I had where I was very much self-will run riot. And I hope I didn't share this on a previous episode. I was at the Y, and somebody I thought treated me very rudely. And I came home and I was just obsessing about how rude he was to me. And I deserve to be treated, more with respect, and how dare he? And I want it thus rather than thus. Well, it's a good example of how after these many years of my working on having a spiritual awakening, I can go in a split second into my patho-adolescency. I guess, you're never too old to be an adolescent again, but it's an unhealthy period in most of our lives because we don't have spiritual maturity. We don't have emotional maturity. We don't have the maturity of an awareness as to who and what we are in the world and who other people are. They have space. They're entitled to take up space here. But when I'm in my self-will run riot ego mind, everybody else is intruding on the space that I'm entitled to. So I really like, this reference here. Our troubles are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves. And it's an extreme example of self-will run riot. But we don't think so. So above everything, we must be rid of our selfishness. We must, or it kills us. Now, let's get on to, in breathing underwater, the spiritual awakening. Here, Richard Rohr goes on to say, spiritual gifts only increase by using them, whereas material gifts normally decrease by usage. Well, let me comment on that. Spiritual gifts are love, awareness, acceptance. And how do they increase and magnify? How does the light shine through? By extending it, by giving it. That's the way we know we have it. You can't give something away if you don't firstly know that you have it. I love a reference to forgiveness, for instance. Forgiving is a blessing of those who know they're forgiven. I must know I'm forgiven to forgive another. It really works that way. So here, in reference to being spiritually awake, spiritual gifts increase by using them. In contrast to in the world, time and space, if you have an object and you give it, you're lessened and the other person is increased. So there's a great moral and spiritual lesson here. And that is that you have to jettison the ego. The ego will never give willingly unless it's giving to get. Whereas our spiritual awakening teaches us that you have everything by giving. First of all, because you have everything that God's given us, and it's inexhaustible. It's eternal. So you can't exhaust it. And the more you give it, the more you realize and you awaken to the fact that you have it. So if I have the intention and the willingness primarily to forgive a brother, which I did in that YMCA example. The next day I saw the guy and I went up and we spoke, and I really like him. You know, he's just a nice guy. So the love came through when I was willing to extend my vulnerability. I didn't know what would happen in the exchange the next day, but I have some progress in spiritual awakening to the point where I can go up to somebody contrary to my ego, which never wants to give an inch. So again, he says we increase by using it, whereas material gifts decrease by usage. Well, let's go on a little bit further. He says, and we're talking about having a spiritual awakening in the context of step 12, for those of you that are 12-steppers, but you don't have to be. You know, we're talking about enlightenment. We're talking about healing and having more of a happy, joyous, and free life experience rather than bitterness and judgment and fear. So he goes on to say, if good works do not accompany faith, it is quite dead. Well, that comes from the New Testament in James. If good works do not accompany faith, it is quite dead. Now here, and I want to tie this in, a spiritual awakening is not something that simply heightens our consciousness and fails in some way to change our lifestyle. Our lifestyle and our relationships have to, by universal truth and by necessity, reflect the awakening. When you awaken, you behave differently. Now we're getting back to the 3 A's, awareness, acceptance, and then action. Well, action does eventually certainly change behaviorally, but it's from that top down, awareness, acceptance, and then action. So again, if good works, the action doesn't accompany the faith, which is the awareness and the acceptance, then it is quite dead. So let's say I'd come home from the Y that first day and I was upset. And I worked it through spiritually, and I resolved that, you know, he didn't do it, I did it to myself. And I don't insist that he be thus, he can be just the way he is. And I accept that. But then the next day when I saw him, let's say I had ignored him and I hadn't gone up. Now I'm making a reference to good works here. I think it made such a difference to both of us. You should have seen, well, he was the one that stuck out his hand and said, hey, blah, 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 and he explained himself. So, you know, he lightened up. Whereas I think if I had skulked around, even though I'd had a spiritual awakening about the incident, he wouldn't have had the benefit of it. And I'm talking about at a physical level. Now, there is a theory that at a metaphysical mind level, when I get clear about something and I forgive someone in my mind, all minds are joined, and he would similarly experience the release because all minds are joined. I always make reference to my wife's Reiki practice, where she doesn't have to be in the same room with somebody when she's working, so to speak, spiritually and extending a healing through love and through touch. That love and touch, quote unquote, can be at a long distance. The person doesn't have to be there because all minds are joined. But again, good works must accompany our faith. And when you see somebody, you give them, and this is, I think, the purpose of the body, very clearly and truthfully. I have to walk around in this body, you know, in this earth suit, as Gary Zukav calls it, and I have to communicate with it. What am I communicating? If I communicate inconsistent with my spiritual awakening, good works, you know, have to accompany it, or the awakening is not an awakening. Okay, point made. Then Richard Rohr goes on. He says, what makes me or anybody think that we really believe in a higher power, God of our understanding, much less follow that higher power, unless we somehow pass it on to the least of the brothers and sisters? And that, of course, the reference to the least of us, least of brothers and sisters, is from Matthew in the New Testament. So here again, we're talking about behavior, and this is why we become happier in the world, having had a spiritual awakening. And we carry the message. This is very consistent with the language in the 12th step. It doesn't say, having had a spiritual awakening, we rejoice and we're happy within ourselves. It says, no, having had a spiritual awakening, we carry this message to others and practice these principles in all our affairs. So there's a definite reference to the communication device that the body represents. And here we are extending the love and the forgiveness and the happiness and the awakening. You know, I've used recently this idea of don't hide your light under a bushel basket, which I think is Christian in origin. Jesus in some way has said that. Well, how do people know? Yes, you can walk around with a glow. You can certainly have your eyes be alive and a smile on your face and your brow is unfurrowed. This is all true. But on the other hand, there's something more, especially with close relationships. When you're in your family of origin, or you're with your children or your spouse or your siblings or your co-workers, this is important, that your body communicate the light. And the way that you do it, and the Buddhists are very clear about this. I love Thich Nhat Hanh's reference to loving kindness. Are you behaving with compassion? Are you being loving and kind? And people appreciate that, but it can't be simply on a behavioral level if it isn't also experienced from within at the mind level. Then it's hollow, and it seems hypocritical and phony. So it begins from within, and then we act accordingly. But again, we have to be loving and kind and compassionate. If I were to represent in a real synthesis the whole enlightening and spiritual awakening journey, it would be how loving and how forgiving and kind are we in our everyday lives, both at a thinking level and at an action level. And when those two meld and we're consistent with that, then we're having an accelerated path to a spiritual awakening. That's what happens. Now, on a personal basis, I'll tell you, there are days when I don't feel like being loving and kind. So I know I have to go within and do my prayer and meditation work. And the prayer and meditation work is step 11. It precedes, of course, step 12, where you have the spiritual awakening. So it identifies very clearly the antecedent to the spiritual awakening is prayer and meditation. We have to work our program from within. It's an internal journey. Once that internal journey is sufficiently begun and we gain traction, then it begins to demonstrate at the behavioral level. And then it kind of is a self-fulfilling loop. So the behavior, I was so fulfilled and just with gratitude when I saw that fellow the second day at the Y, and he, extended his hand to me. It was wonderful, and I look forward to seeing him again. I really do. So the behavior then confirms the thoughts, and the thoughts then reconfirm the behavior, and it's this wonderful spiritual awakening. Ultimately, what happens in the spiritual awakening, from my experience and from what I've been reading for over 40 years, is that we're less and less attached to the outcome at the physical level. So I may go up to somebody with the loving kindness and forgiveness that I had learned through prayer and meditation, and they rebuff me. The more spiritually awake I am, the more I'll know that doesn't mean anything. I was fortunate in this instance where, he was very open and apologetic. I think he might have felt badly, about the incident as well. But it doesn't always work out that way. I remember I was volunteering somewhere here in Nashville several years ago. I was a volunteer, And the person that I worked with was a staff member. And we didn't get along, and I ultimately had to leave that volunteer position. Sometime later, I saw them, and I tried to bring up my discontent with the situation. And I tried, I think, to make amends, you know, to have this loving kindness. They would have none of it. And it was, I don't think I was prepared either. I must say it began with me. I had not had a sufficient spiritual awakening to make that exchange where they would be open to it and then mirror the love back to me. And I remember it being awful. And so now whenever I see them, and I see them periodically, it's very awkward and uncomfortable. So as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, okay, I've had some spiritual awakenings since then, and it is a process. Maybe I could go up to them next time and talk with them. This is something I'll have to do some prayer and meditation about. At least I can demonstrate that it's resolved within me by smiling at this person and saying hello to them rather than this avoidance number that they and I are doing. That's good stuff. You know, I've said this before too so often. I'm always teaching to learn. And this is a good example, you know, of the more I teach this, the more I get some spiritual awakening and insights so that I can take it out into my life today and tomorrow. And I hope that I'm encouraging people by these episodes. So let's see if there's anything else I wanted to share with you here. And then we'll wrap this up. Listen to this concluding paragraph from Richard Rohr's book, Breathing Underwater. He says, what makes me or anybody think they can really believe in a higher power unless we pass it on to the least of the brothers and sisters? Then he says, and this is a reference to the first law of thermodynamics, which is very analogous, I think, to the extension of love and being compassionate and kind. The first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot really be created or destroyed. It is merely converted to different uses. So here we have all this energy within our minds, and the creative process is subject to how we direct that energy, lovingly or with fear and judgment. And the choice is always ours. But the energy exists. And as the first law of thermodynamics says, it can't be destroyed. It's merely subject to being converted to different uses. Well, he goes on, what comes around must go around, or it does not come around again. Well, here's the reference that I'd like to say. You and I are as God created us. We have the creative power to use that energy consistent with our spiritual awakening. Use it today with those that you love, and especially use it with those that you're not so sure that you like or love. That's the key to a further awakening in our cases. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Namaste, shalom, and peace. Bye now.